Thank you very much, Peter, for those warm words and for your introduction. I am, as I look around the room, very conscious that as a visiting or guest speaker, I have in fact travelled the shortest distance of all of you. So it really is very much my pleasure for you to come here from far and wide across University Square and indeed beyond. I should also, in saying thanks, of course, recognise, as Peter has done already, that this project, which I'm working on, is sponsored by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Without that generous funding, the research travel which I've undertaken over the last year or so, and the writing on this subject would not have been possible. Of course, that project was led by Professor Fergal McGarry, who's PI, Professor Ed Delaney, co-principal investigator at the University of Edinburgh, and my co-postdoctoral research fellow, Dr. Brian Hanley, also at the University of Edinburgh. But if I may, I would like also to point out, in terms of thanks, the people in this room today, because I think you'll acknowledge, as we look across the seats around us, that in essence we have an emerging centre of global history amongst the faculty here at Queen's University Belfast. I've enjoyed over the last year or so many conversations with those who specialise in African history, Asian history, European history and beyond, and hopefully you'll find a flavour of those coffeed conversations in the next 40 minutes or so of these remarks. On the one hand, the world, with its profusion of facts, political, social, economic, ideological, and on the other hand, the work, apparently solitary, always ambiguous, since it lends itself to different meanings. For the most part, the study of each of these two continents proceeds in an autonomous fashion. The two geographies seldom coincide. Unquote. And that comes from Roland Barthes, the philosopher, in his Sur Racine from 1963. Inherent in Roland Barthes' apostrophe, I would argue, is a metaphorical critique of the global historical turn, that intellectual differential between the scale of global history and the specificity of its sources. And this differential, so to speak, has been an argument resurgent in the last number of years. In his 2016 study, What is Global History?, Sebastian Conrad has argued that this, quote, it presumes and reflects on some form of global integration. There have always been cross-border exchanges, but their operation and impact depended on the degree of systematic integration on a global scale, unquote. Following, in 2017, Jeremy Edelman asked, what is global history now? Barely a year apart, observing that, quote, the logic of global history tended to dwell on integration and concord rather than disintegration and discord. He argued that we need narratives of global life that reckon with disintegration as well as integration, if we are going to come to terms with the deep histories of global transformations, unquote. Following from this, in a discussion in the Journal of Global History with Edelman and the French historian David Bell, published last year, Richard Drayton and David Mottedel argued for, quote, a self-conscious global history, which neither neglects the small spaces nor evades the specificity and strangeness of disconnected historical experience. The macro and the micro are perspectives that need to be consciously brought into dialogue, unquote. And Maxine Berg, in the same year, concluded from her Centre for Global History at the University of Warwick that global history too must now with urgency engage with the particularities of local spaces and the diversities of lived environments. One might argue that in terms of an Irish world history, we can look to the exemplar of British world history, which has kind of emerged exponentially over the last 15 years. But however, some scholars have already begun to speak of the end of the British world, Boris Johnson and Brexit aside. And in their recent historiographical review article after the British world, Rachel Bright and Andrew Dilley argue that, quote, the British world, while making valuable contributions to the historiography of empire and of individual nations, fails ultimately to achieve a sufficiently clear definition to constitute a distinctive field of study, unquote. So where, I ask you, in this world of global history is Ireland? Writing of the global Irish as a case study in 2003, Kevin Kenny proposed, quote, a prime subject for historical inquiry is how the diasporic sensibilities of a given migrant people vary according to the places where they reside. This is where the diaspora excels, capturing the fluidity, hybridity, and frequent ambiguity of transnational interactions. Unquote. Now, Kevin Kenny's article of faith in Irish World Studies, so to speak, has in time been expanded upon by other leading scholars. In 2009, Don Akinson was to intercede, quote, "Our mission should be to chart Irish nationalism as a small but not insignificant global cultural system," unquote. And 2 years later, Enda Delaney added that, quote, "The worldwide nature of this diaspora settlement requires a history of late modern Ireland that transcends the nation as the primary unit of analysis, and which embraces more ambitious, interpretive, and conceptual frameworks," unquote. Global intellectual history, I would argue, and I hope this paper will argue, offers one such framework. Now, this is not to separate a global intellectual history from the natural empiricism of the Irish historiographical tradition, which has been raised by some historians in their appraisal of global history. The early modern scholar Bartolomé Yun Casaya has noted that, for example, global history involves a clear movement of the historian's laboratory from the archive to the library, unquote. But I would argue conversely that the Irish Revolution, which of course you might say is the epitome of this empirical tradition in Irish historiography, Peter Hart talked about it being the best documented revolution in world history, can be looked upon afresh, and questions can be asked afresh of it through the prism, or prisms, plural, of intellectual history. As David Armitage has observed, quote, "As historians reconstruct their form of intellection and the histories of their ideas, we can expect to find even more widespread evidence of forms of transnational thinking than ever before," unquote. This paper, The Republic of Letters, Ireland and the World, 1919 to 23, attempts to bridge those two global histories, the two geographies, macrohistory and microhistory, in the form of intellectual history, to explore Ireland's worlds between Declaration of Independence in 1919 and its joining of the League of Nations 1923. And I would posit that this is an important, indeed, integral intervention to the future writing, but also commemoration of this period of history. We are in danger, potentially, given the event-driven narratives of the next 3 to 4 years, War of Independence, Civil War, of following in an O'Malleyan epithet to the Irish Revolution of raids and rallies. And I think there's a visual representation which I wanted to show you, which can present to you in kind of clear visual and visible form how this narrative might evolve or escalate to the exclusion of intellectual history. So those are kind of probably the most familiar images to you of what the Irish Revolution was, very much an event or chronology-driven narrative. And my concern is not only with the terrible soundtrack to those sets of images, but furthermore that they may introduce or perhaps maintain or reduce rather the Irish Revolution to stories of Ireland and questions of isolation, such as how significant was the Solihull Beg ambush? Where did Sinn Féin win local elections during the War of Independence? And who caused the Civil War, Liam Neeson or Alan Rickman? So, looking again at our sources from transnational perspective, as Niall Wheelahan would have it, can open Ireland to questions of global historical import and global historiographical moment. How was our island story interpreted by global commentators in the interwar period? Was the Irish War of Independence, much less the Civil War, a divisive global experience, West versus Rest? And where, and in what spatial context, was the revolution indeed Irish? This paper considers these questions by locating the quote-unquote Irish Republic in global intellectual contexts. It conceptualizes Dáil Éireann not as an institutional government, but as an idea transferred and translated globally across political cultures. The meeting of the first Dáil, this research suggests, was defined not as an Irish capital event, but as a changing story in the news of the world. This study further recreates the Irish Republic as an imagined community of individuals and ideas, created in writing between Ireland and the world. Citizenship of this metaphysical republic, it proposes, could be identified beyond Irish birth or descent, and by the circulation of intellectual thought in the form of correspondence and journals. Finally, this paper explores the circulation and exchange of texts on and beyond Ireland, arguing that the case for the Irish Republic was refined in a dialectic process of reading, writing, and revision. The two geographies, passé Barthez, can be together written. This is going to happen a lot, by the way. I'll reach for the keyboard and it'll look here before me. Okay. So on the 21st of January 1919, Dáil Éireann addressed the international community for the first time. Emerging from the First World War and the 1918 general election, Irish Republicans arrived at the Mansion House, Dublin, a successor state in waiting. At Versailles, world leaders were deciding the fates of global empires in terms of self-determination. This, to use Erez Manella's term, was Ireland's Wilsonian moment. No country ever started its international career with better prospects than were with ours after the war, Sinn Féin TD George Gavin Duffy later reflected, unquote. Ireland had every reason to expect rapidly to become recognised as the first of the small nations, unquote. International recognition of Irish independence, however, might well be endorsed in the opening press coverage of the Dáil. 4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets, Napoleon once remarked of French revolutionary influence in Europe. Irish revolutionaries on the 21st of January 1919, I would argue, faced significant challenges in translating that first meeting of Dáil Éireann into newspaper coverage in Paris, Washington, Beijing and beyond. How was the news from Dublin transferred across the British world? What were the perceptions of Dáil Éireann in Africa and in Asia? And how was the Irish Republic, quote unquote, interpreted in the Soviet Union and the United States, respectively? The digitization of international newspapers through the World Newspaper Archive opens new pages and new languages through which we can reassess the first Dáil. So of the 101 MPs elected in Ireland at the United Kingdom general election in December of 1918, 29 in fact took their seats on the 21st of January 1919, not at Westminster, but at the Mansion House in Dublin. And their assembly in the capital at 3:30 p.m. was to fulfil the electoral promise of Sinn Féin, and indeed the ideological goal of Irish nationalism, that being the establishment of an independent parliament. Standing before an expectant audience of 1,000, including some 70 foreign news reporters, they presented themselves as Teachtaí Dála, or deputies of the Dáil. Brian Farrell would later capture this Republican zeitgeist, quote, "They are there to make history, and they knew it," unquote. Speaking in Irish, Cathal Brugha, who was then acting Príomh-Mhara, or Prime Minister, proclaimed the legislative powers of the Revolutionary Assembly, comprising Dáil ministries for finance, foreign affairs, home affairs and defence. He then announced the Declaration of Independence, ratifying the Irish Republic proclaimed in arms in 1916, and English and French translations of that document would follow. The message to the free nations of the world, finally, was read by Count Plunkett in French and J.J. O'Kelly in Irish, making the case for international recognition of the Irish Republic at this, quote, dawn of the promised era of self-determination. Plunkett, alongside the then imprisoned Arthur Griffith and Eamon de Valera, was delegated to address the Paris Peace Conference. The democratic programme, Dáil Éireann's agenda for social reform, finally, was recited in Irish and English. In conclusion, at 5:20 p.m, the first Dáil could be read as the Government of Ireland now officially established. However, the concept of Dáil Éireann would travel and indeed be transferred across political cultures, geographies, and interpretations in Europe and beyond. The London newspapers generated early coverage. As Maurice Walsh has observed, quote, reports appearing in British newspapers helped to set the agenda for journalists from further afield. Unquote. So what was the London news from Dublin? History will probably date the definite decline of the Sinn Féin movement from the day when its National Assembly was opened in Dublin. Today, the Sinn Féin Parliament has a distinctly bad press, unquote. So wrote the Times on the 23rd of January, and it seems that this editorial was indeed the editorial of record. Many of the London dailies would follow the Times, talking and remarking upon the impracticability of this Sinn Féin self-government. The Daily Mail would argue, quote, the country has arrived at a political cul-de-sac where the nominal leaders can neither retreat nor advance. The Daily Express added, Sinn Féin has reached its high watermark. So this opening of a Dáil Parliament, hallowed in the history, in the annals of Irish history, was kind of open to kind of ridicule and deliberate misinterpretation on the part of the British press, who summarised that it was in fact an illogical political act. The reading of speeches as Gaeilge accounted partly for the limited reporting of the Dáil's proceedings in the British press, only the Times chronicling the day's events. Indeed, the use of the Irish language, it was widely suggested, had undermined that very opening and the legitimacy of that parliament. The Daily Mirror commented, quote, hardly more than a third of the members themselves understood this quote-unquote native language, unquote. Furthermore, it can be discerned that a stage Irish motif recurred in some of the analysis. For example, the Daily Express stated that it is yet a question whether a tragedy or a farce has been staged in Dublin, unquote. The events in Dublin, the London press prescribed, were therefore performative politics, unreal and consequently unrecognisable. Pervasive reading across the London dailies, this dismissive coverage ultimately may have been convincing reading, undermining the reality of an Irish Parliament, much less an Irish Republic, to British readers. Indeed, as late as 1921, the Dáil Éireann envoy to London, Art O'Brien, more on him later, would comment, quote, our people here do not yet envisage the orders of An Dáil as positive and definite, unquote. Reflecting on Britain's influence over the international press and representations of Ireland to the world, Arthur Griffith once famously used the metaphor of a paper wall. On the inside, she told Ireland what she wanted us to believe about the world, and on the outside, she told the world what she wanted the world to believe about us, unquote. The question now, of course, was, will the English press's description of this concept of Dáil Éireann as illusory now become its lingua franca? De notre correspondant particulière, le Parlement Sinn Féin a tenu sa première réunion à l'Hôtel de Ville de Dublin cet après-midi. This is from L'Echo de Paris, which translates as, from our special correspondent, the Sinn Féin Parliament held its first meeting in Dublin's Town Hall this afternoon. It could be argued that in January 1919, the news from Paris was the news of the world. Opening the pages of the French press thus opens Dáil Éireann, quote-unquote, to transnational translation. Le Parlement Sinn Féin, as it became known in the French press, was the subject of 24-hour news headlines in the Parisian dailies. Le programme des Sinn Féiners, le matin. Le Sinn Féin et l'indépendance irlandaise, le temps. Et le Sinn Féiner proclame la République, le petit journal. However, the political meaning of Dáil Éireann was in fact ordered across the print space of French newspapers. written off the front page, Le Parlement Sinn Féin read not as part of this New World Order, quote unquote, at Versailles with Woodrow Wilson, etc., but as part of the New World disorder beyond it. News from the Irish Republic was currently placed alongside reports of rebellion in Portugal, mutiny in Morocco, and revolution in Russia. Far from the idea of a respectable parliament espoused by Sinn Féin TDs in Dublin, Parisian newspapers recast Dáil Éireann as a radical assembly in their secondary coverage of events in Dublin. Sean T. O'Kelly would write exasperatedly to Eamon de Valera following his appointment as Dáil Éireann envoy to Paris in February 1919, quote, "You have no idea of the difficulty of the French papers and the delicate handling they require." Quote. Parisian newspapers, it could be argued, published a French version of Dáil Éireann. This was, however, not the story in Russia. Indeed, the Soviet Party's national daily Pravda, or Truth, took little interest in the first meeting of Dáil Éireann. Events in Dublin, when published, were reported rather as an international curiosity, external to the interests of the Soviet regime and its readers. My Russian language classes aren't proceeding as well as I hoped, so I'm going to give you all a pass on my attempt to Russian, but next semester I hope to graduate to beginner. So the Pravda in the English translation says, Irish Constituent Assembly, the Italian press reports interesting detail about the events in Ireland. A constituent assembly was convened in Dublin. It is the understanding of the Irish Sinn Féin party that the Irish Republic exists since the Rising. A solemn announcement regarding this was sent to all states, unquote. And news of this Irish Republic, so called, in future would in fact be presented to Russian readers as foreign affairs, not interestingly as part of a global anti-imperial revolution which one might expect in their press. Indeed, communicating from Moscow in 1921, Dáil envoy Patrick McCartan conveyed this very impression to Dublin. Quote, "The newspapers printed in Russian on the whole, I believe, are almost entirely propaganda intended for the Russian people. The whole aim is to propagate the ideals of communism, and very little attention is given to any movement in any country which does not tend to that direction. The revolution in Ireland was a national one, and hence, it was concluded, had little or nothing in common with communism or indeed the world revolution." And this idea of Dáil Éireann moves across geographical spaces contemporarily, but offers different versions or views of what the Irish Republic and the Irish Parliament was. So as it migrated from Europe to North America, it could be argued the story or the presentation of this republic had changed. So a feature of the coverage, for example, on the East Coast of the United States, Boston Globe, New York Times, and Baltimore Sun, was their focused reporting of one of Dáil Éireann's founding documents. They're actually looking at some of the key texts which Dáil Éireann is presenting as a legitimizing factor, namely the address to the free nations of the world and its claims to geostrategic importance between Ireland and the United States. The Boston Globe says, quote, "It is pointed out that Ireland is the gateway to the great seas and the last outpost in Western Europe, where the commerce of the East and the West meet." Unquote. And this first print, so to speak, of the Dáil, circulated via the Associated Press, drew editorial comment elsewhere across the United States. The Chicago Tribune stated, "The Irish Republic is not a reality. Look at the map and see why. British commerce with America would be at the mercy of hostile marine bases on the Irish coast." Unquote. So further, unlike the British press, the Russian press, even the French press, which you might expect to pick up on founding documents of an Irish Republic, it's only when you reach the United States that we see this kind of attention to, what were these kind of founding documents. So, for example, the Chicago Tribune goes with the headline, "Sinn Féiners' Bill of Independence." And this idea of a Declaration of Independence carries the masthead and therefore the prism by which the Irish Republic is defined in newspapers from the Atlanta Constitution to the San Francisco Chronicle. Okay, so there's some sense of an adaptation of this Irish Parliament that in the form of a Declaration of Independence, it has a form of legitimacy. It's worth interrogating further, you might say. American adaptations of events in Dublin, however, were not transferred over the Canadian border. And while the Toronto-based national daily The Globe ran Associated Press content, it adopted an imperial position in line with language from London. They called themselves a parliament. The Dublin performance will be a boon to the tail-twisting elements in the United States and the British Empire. And this sense of kind of mistrust of the media in the United States and North America more broadly, based on the perceived influence or malinfluence of the British media and the British Empire or British world, is written about by De Valera, who of course would arrive there in June 1919. He states, quote, "Never forget that the press is an instrument used by the enemy," unquote. And this was a reading which would return throughout his American tour. And as you can see from some of the headlines behind me, this concept of Dáil Éireann travelled and changed around the world, depending according to culture, but also language. So south of the equator, news of Dáil Éireann crossed the Latin language barrier as well, as I'll kind of outline. So gravitating from Central America, so El Universal goes with Irlanda y el Chauvinismo for Mexico. Los Sinn Féiners han proclamado la República en Dublín, El Mundo en Cuba, and La Independencia de Irlanda, Nuevo Tiempo in Honduras. And reports furthermore reached Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. But unlike Europe, unlike North America further, these reports presented the First Dáil not as a movement for national independence, but rather as an extension of the First World War, or more precisely, as an extension of a European conflagration. Okay, so in Buenos Aires, la prensa dice la gran conflagración europea agitación shinfinista. Sao Paulo's Major Daly said, "O armisticio Congreso Republicano da Irlanda." And Santiago's El Mercurio said, "La Liga de las Naciones, los acentos de Irlanda." So it's this juxtaposition of the First Dáil with a different context. The First World War, the end of the First World War. This is a First World War story in South America. Dáil Éireann would appoint envoys to Argentina, Brazil, and Chile in 1921. Quote, "Until real progress is made in diplomatic and trade relations with Argentina, Chile, and Brazil," its Buenos Aires representative Patrick Little would later remark, "there is no use wasting money on the other republics, except on press propaganda." Now, we've been fortunate enough to have had a trial run of the World Newspaper Archive during the summer of this year, in which we have had access to Latin American newspapers, Asian newspapers, and also African newspapers. But one of the problems, I think, which we need to consider when we are thinking about writing a global history of anything is, of course, the availability through digitization of newspapers and what they represent. So many of the newspapers, in terms of Africa, for instance, which I had the opportunity to look at, were English-speaking, and as I'll kind of discern a little bit here, were obviously for the kind of the Greater British audience, so to speak. So it's very difficult at times to try and detect the kind of the meaning of Dáil Éireann or other Irish events more broadly. But nonetheless, reports of Ireland reached English-speaking newspapers in Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and modern-day Zimbabwe via Reuters, that key information broker of the British Empire. However, it was in relation to South Africa, especially, that news of the Dáil communicated greatest concern in Africa in the newspapers that I've looked at. So, for example, the Harare-published Rhodesian Herald cautioned readers as to the dangerous irrationality of Irish and South African revolutionaries. Quote, "There are problems which, from their very illogicality, appear to defy all principles. Not least among these is the class to which Sinn Féinism and South African nationalism together belong." Unquote. Arriving on the Cape as Dáil Éireann envoy in 1921, the well-travelled P.J. Little would remind the cabinet in Dublin, quote, "The English-speaking community is not interested. Part of it is intensely anti-Irish and anti-Catholic. The English papers are entirely jingo." And as before, it could be argued that reports of Dáil Éireann in the African-based but English-speaking press were indeed published for a Greater Britain consumption. You also see the news of the First Dáil and this concept of the Dáil travelling and changing across the Indian Ocean, reaching modern-day Bangladesh and Pakistan, in addition to India. So it features in the Times of India, for example, the Tribune, and Amrita Bazar Patrika. And in that latter publication, I think it's quite interesting that rather than running with an editorial line and therefore a conceptual paradigm from London, which is what we see elsewhere in North America, they actually tried to critique this emerging Dáil Éireann and Irish Republic for their readers. They say, quote, "The Sinn Féiner is not a mere politician nationalist. Sinn Féin is a Gaelic word, and it means the same thing as our own word Swadeshi." Unquote. And connections to the Swadeshi independence movement will be made continually, indeed, between 1919 and 1921. Further east, London news networks linked metropolitan Asia. Port cities along the South China Sea exchanged information in English as part of their global trade. Leaders in the Canton Times, Shanghai Times, and the Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post, accordingly, praised this Irish Republic for their readers, but based on columns of news from London. So British influence indeed extended across the East China Sea, indeed to Tokyo as well, where the independently owned Japan Times carried London Times news reports, decrying the reality of Dáil Éireann. And Dáil Éireann would only in fact begin translating its documents into Mandarin and into Japanese for export from January 1921. Finally, the press in Australia and New Zealand imported news of Ireland directly from London, linking Oceania to what Simon Potter has termed a British imperial press system. Times reports of Dáil Éireann, for example, were printed in the Adelaide Advertiser, Perth's Western Australian, Auckland's New Zealand Herald, and Wellington's Dominion Post. These accounts, however, were far from a London press writ large. News of the Dáil's first meeting was reprinted, consequently, in the Australian and New Zealand press, alongside reports of emerging news of violence from Ireland. The violence which we're referring to, as I kind of alluded to earlier, was the attack at Sullow Beg in County Tipperary, in which IRA volunteers killed 2 RIC men, and generally perceived to be the beginning of the Irish War of Independence. But because of the distance travelled in terms of cable news, even at this stage, that news actually filtered through to Australasia, about a week or two after the first Dáil. So while the first Dáil was kind of the first run of the first Dáil, kind of went with the London press version as such, the second edition, so to speak, a couple of weeks later, actually juxtaposed this first meeting of the Dáil now with political violence, obviously trying to present the kind of conspiratorial and seditious aspects of that. So, for example, the Sydney Sun read, "Sinn Féin Parliament, 2 policemen shot." The Christchurch Press regarded "Republican Parliament, murder and robbery." So reports of Dáil Éireann and what this meant were subtly re-edited in the pages of the Australasian press to equate Irish self-government with violence and disloyalty. Some opinion pieces, however, were more explicit. "Trouble will come out of the irregular Assembly of Dublin," the Melbourne Argus argued. The Otago Daily Times went further. "A mob of political hooligans collected in Dublin have proclaimed an Irish Republic." And the Dáil Éireann envoy to Australia and New Zealand, Osmond Grattan Esmond, in as late as 1921, would again report on this kind of loyalism influencing kind of perceptions of Ireland and the Irish Republic, even as late as 1921, stating that an aggressive British loyalty is shared by the totality of the press. Republicanism and separatism are now enthusiastically suppressed as sedition and treason. Unquote. Irish representatives would find it difficult to get a fair press for Dáil Éireann in British-controlled Australia. On the 21st of January 1919, Dáil Éireann addressed the international community for the first time. Proclaiming an independent parliament and Irish Republic as established fact, the Mansion House Assembly issued a recognisable message to the free nations of the world. But events in Dublin read differently in Toronto, Sao Paulo, Sydney and Tokyo. Movement across space and time shaped the scope and indeed significance of the news from Ireland. More specifically, in terms of microhistory, movement across the print spaces of cosmopolitan newspapers shaped its meaning. The concept of Dáil Éireann contemporarily was open to international interpretation. So I would argue that reading this first meeting of the Dáil, which we will do in the next couple of months on the centenary, as Gaeilge, or in Irish alone, so to speak, reduces Irish history to a single nation translation. The first Dáil was a global idea which was narrated and negotiated around the world according to language, political culture, and international exchange. Perhaps Napoleon was right. 4 foreign newspapers were more to be feared than 1,000 rifles. These are just some of the envoys who I spoke about a little bit earlier that kind of carried the news of the Republican government in Dáil Éireann beyond the pages, so to speak, of the international press, presenting the Irish nationalist Republican version of what the Dáil Éireann was. But beyond the pages of the international press, it could be argued that Dáil Éireann can be reconceptualized contemporarily in the 21st century. While in Florence at the European University Institute and reading through the League of Nations records, I came across a very interesting letter from Gabriele D'Annunzio, the Italian soldier, poet, playwright, and author, who addressed the Secretariat in Paris, quote, "The High Command of Fiume, having determined that the British Empire, by imposing on Ireland, Egypt, and India the most cruel and iniquitous yoke, has rendered itself more unworthy of the esteem and confidence of civilized nations than any other state accused of militaristic crimes. Fiume now associates itself with the analogous declaration of the Irish Republic." And what I want to propose over the next few minutes is that both in content and in form, D'Annunzio's letter to the League of Nations can indicate to us useful means and productive means by which we can reconceptualize what the Irish Republic was in the form of a republic of letters. And what I'm basing this on essentially is, of course, that early modern kind of proto-Enlightenment era idea of this republic of letters. So in the late 17th and 18th centuries, scholars from France corresponded with public intellectuals, published authors, and political activists across Europe, the Americas, and beyond, creating in writing, so the practice of writing, a long-distance imagined community of ideas, interests, and identities, a quote-unquote republic of letters. Citizenship of this metaphysical republic, which existed parallel and perhaps in opposition to the French monarchy, was defined, indeed refined, by the circulation of intellectual thought as correspondence, periodical, and publication. And a number of early modern historians have kind of suggested that this collapsing the distinction between discourse and political reality is essential to understanding what the Republic of Letters was in this European early modern concept. So Francois Furet, Lane Hunt, and Keith Baker all argued that discourse was the reality of this Republic of Letters, and therefore has the same status as the monarchy in France. Dana Goodman, in her seminal study of the Republic of Letters, furthermore, has argued that it was a form of intellectual exchange in which criticism was a characteristic discourse of a new and authentic public sphere in which private people came together to use their reason publicly. So that there's an intellectual exchange which constantly defines and indeed refines what this republic was through intellectual debate. And one of the key aspects of it, of course, was merit being the avowed foundation. Citizenship was defined by one's contribution rather than one's ethnicity per se. Now, in terms of Ireland, you could argue by the time of D'Annunzio's letter to the League of Nations in early 1920 that the Irish Republic existed, certainly in a global sense, primarily on paper. In September of 1919, Dáil Éireann had been proclaimed by the British state as an illegal assembly. The first Dáil met in total, this illegal assembly, had met in total 14 times in 1919, and only 3 occasions in 1920 and 4 in 1921. The Republic of Letters as a form, an alternative space, you might say, to understand this Republican government or Republican ideal, I think is also really interesting to think about it because of the Irish diaspora community or communities which lived beyond the island of Ireland. So this long-distance correspondence, which the Republic of Letters was based on in the early Enlightenment period, was an interesting kind of concept or paradigm to treat of in terms of the Irish diaspora and bringing them into the story of the Irish Revolution. A very important case of that, of course, was Eamon de Valera, who was in the United States between June 1919 and December 1920, who was technically First Minister and self-proclaimed President of the Irish Republic. And his voluminous correspondence back to Ireland is a very interesting series by which to understand the broader and more capacious Republic of Letters. Indeed, Charles Townshend was to write of the Irish Republic by early 1920, quote, "The virtual state faced what might now be called a credibility deficit." Okay. So I'm going to look at at one particular person for time constraints, but the point that I'm trying to argue is that individuals are immensely significant to our understanding of the global Irish Revolution, not because they preserve letters in and of themselves, and therefore they're significant to the historical record and historical memory, but because they serve as intermediaries or cultural brokers between continents, cultures, and collective action. And that's been identified by people like Pierre-Yves Saunier, Patricia Clavin, in terms of global or transnational history as well. So the person I'm going to focus on is Art O'Brien, or O'Brien on the left, who was Dáil Éireann envoy to London from early 1919. He was based in London. He was president of the Gaelic League, president of Sinn Féin in London, and also leader of the kind of self-proclaimed Irish Self-Determination League from 1919. And what I found from going through O'Brien's letters and his voluminous correspondence is what Michael Goebbels termed an anti-imperial metropolis in the early interwar period, whereby London, through O'Brien's connections, refracted and reflected the kind of ongoing anti-colonial discourse which was pulsing through the immediate post-war period. And this is represented in the print material in O'Brien's collection in terms of he was in correspondence with Burmese, Egyptian, Indian, Scottish and Welsh nationalists within the context of the British Empire alone. Indeed, in the cosmopolitan streetscapes of London, O'Brien welcomed different nationalist groups as Ireland's allies. His offices off the Strand, offering a salon, so to speak, for the discussion of collective ideas and action. Okay, and what's interesting about O'Brien as well is that he not only connects, Dublin to the Empire and the Empire to Dublin in this revolutionary moment, so to speak, he also connects the broader diaspora community. So he's writing to De Valera, forwarding him correspondence from Egyptian nationalists while he's in New York. He's writing to Collins on a regular basis in Dublin, and Sean T. O'Kelly, the Dáil Éireann envoy to Paris as well. So it's this kind of webs of empire, so to speak, that we're kind of alluding to. Writing to Sean T. O'Kelly in Paris in May 1919, he writes, quote, "I assume that you are in close touch with the Egyptian delegation in Paris. I am in touch here with their representative, Dr. Omar, who is a fine intellectual character." And this was Prince Omar Toussaint, grandson of Said Pasha, the Vali of Egypt in the mid-19th century. Later on, O'Brien would argue, "I think it is really important for them all, India, Egypt, etc., to recognize that our triumph will be the triumph of all, and consequently, it is really therefore more in the interests, in one way, for them to work hard for our success." Okay. So in terms of Egypt, for example, after the war, evidently, we have the arrival of Saad Zaghloul, the vice president of the Egyptian Assembly, who attempted to form a delegation to the Paris Peace Conference, expelled by the British to Malta and later the Seychelles, but he arrived in London for negotiations in 1920. And it's to Art O'Brien, or through Art O'Brien, that he and the Egyptian delegation in 1920 and 1921 turn. The Egyptians end up signing an accord in July 1920, which ends the British Protectorate. And interestingly, Churchill, who's observing from London evidently, writes a memo that if the same accord was applied to Ireland as was applied to Egypt in July 1920, with small omissions, it would constitute an acceptance of the demands of the Irish nationalist leader De Valera, unquote. So there is this kind of comparison on the part of the British state that if they actually were aware of each other's negotiations and the language of and discourse around and the intellectual ideas around negotiation, this would be a problem. And this occurs actually in November of 1921, so about 2 weeks before the treaty is the Anglo-Irish Treaty is signed. An Egyptian delegation meets under the auspices of the Egyptian Independence Society in November 1921, and they formulate a set of proposals by which they would accept British rule, some sense of British rule in Egypt itself. They forward those proposals in the form of a 5-page document or memorandum to Art O'Brien in London to be circulated back to Dublin in anticipation of the final weeks of the Anglo-Irish Treaty settlement. So there is this kind of circulation through the London offices of the Republican movement of what the Irish Republic would be. Interestingly then, O'Brien, through his imperial networks and contacts, through writing to these Burmese nationalists who had been active since the war, the Young Men Buddhist Association, He actually received correspondence from this group asking for a copy of the Egyptian delegation and their correspondence in terms of future negotiations with Britain as well. So there's kind of an anti-imperial, anti-colonial correspondence or print culture circulating through this London office of the Irish Republican movement. Interestingly, the letter to O'Brien from the Burmese nationalists state, quote, "Burma has gone Sinn Féin," unquote. And this is a recurring trope. You'll see as well a letter to O'Brien from Indian nationalists state in late 1921 that the Indian National Congress will meet in December. There is a plan afoot to declare a national parliament and to set up in connection with it an independent government on Sinn Féin lines. So it has this kind of cultural significance resonance, which politically, culturally, and intellectually circulate through London. And so there's kind of that ongoing set of kind of ideas about what independence means, how each colonial grouping or negotiating team can, use their intellectual exchange to their benefit politically. It's also very interesting to look at Art O'Brien in terms of his connections to Celtic nationalists in Britain itself. He's in correspondence with people like Ruaidhrí Erskine of Mar, William Gillies, who were Scottish nationalists who form the precursor to the Scottish National Party, the Scottish National League, who are essentially kind of Gaelic versions of the Gaelic League. They espouse cultural nationalism, the speaking of Gaelic cultural traditions, etc. But in terms of this Republic of Letters, I wanted to point out that much like the Republic of Letters of the Enlightenment era, their integration into this more capacious Irish Republic, which allowed for non-Irish persons or citizens, so to speak, was not definite. It was based, as I said earlier, much like the Republic of Letters of yore, on merit, how you could contribute to the intellectual progress and development of what the Irish Republic was and what our mutual interests were. So, for example, Michael Collins, when reviewing their case at the very beginning, said, "It is certainly our obvious duty to develop these people everywhere," regarding Scottish and Welsh nationalists. And they asked Art O'Brien to contribute to their journal, Liberty, but also, as you can see behind me, the Scottish Review, in which they write articles of mutual interest on Scottish nationalism, on Irish nationalism, again, trying to not only support their independence movements, but develop the intellectual case for their respective movements. Ultimately, however, the Scottish and Welsh nationalists were not integrated into this kind of triumvirate of anti-colonial nationalisms on the part of the Irish Republic. They were excluded, so to speak, from the Irish Republic. There was some sense of peer review, so to speak, that much disliked word in these circles, in which, for example, in the Irish Bulletin, which was a propaganda newspaper published by Dáil Éireann talking about the Irish Republican movement, that the Irish Bulletin constantly used the term British rather than English. And Art O'Brien had to mediate between Scottish nationalists in their critique of this document, of this literary review, stating, "Our advanced Scotch friends very much object to the use of the word British instead of English, and they are trying to make their own people adopt their proper word English." Okay. The use of the word British conveys to the outside world that we are at war with all parts of the British Empire, whereas our fight is like the fight of our advanced Scottish friends, as well as Egypt and India. Okay. Later submissions on the part of these Scottish nationalists and a kind of a proto-proclamation for Scottish independence, for example, meet with the rejection of Michael Collins and Art O'Brien as not being sufficiently of a high quality or standard. They also propose a economic cooperative group across the British Empire, again, which in this kind of literary sense is rejected in terms of peer review for not being, of the quality or threshold for this Irish Republic. And Michael Collins would write to Art O'Brien on the 8th of April 1921 of the Scottish nationalists and Welsh nationalists, quote, "Isn't it a pity that their end of it was not more advanced at this juncture?" Quote. Interestingly, Art O'Brien, when he died in 1949, would be described by an Egyptian nationalist in his obituary as, quote, "a citizen of Europe and the world." Okay, and those are some of the kind of more elaborate representations of this Irish Bulletin, this propaganda document, which was issued by the Dáil for international consumption. In this occasion, not through London. So they have French editions, Italian editions, and German editions, which are circulated around the world to try and break through the so-called paper wall and represent the Irish Republic as a reality. So it's interesting, I think, to look at these documents rather than purely for the political statements, but as a literary enterprise which was critiqued, commented upon, and reviewed by other nationalists in a way to develop and reinforce what the Republic of Letters was. I'm showing you this image partly because it's relevant, partly because I just love this image. So this is De Valera in the States wearing the Native American headdress at the Chippewa Reservation. But I think the quote is particularly salient to this idea of a broader canvas to citizenship. He says, "I want to show you that though I am white, I am not of the English race. You say you are not free, neither are we, and I sympathize with you because we are making a similar fight. As a boy, I read and understood of your slavery and longed to become one of you." So this becoming of one another is a huge part of this Republic of Letters idea in its most capacious sense. Two very brief just references really in terms of reading the Revolution, how one might pursue a literary or intellectual survey or study of this revolutionary period. And I kind of use the term foreign text in inverted commas there. The first is a book published by Roger Chavire, who was in fact professor of French at University College Dublin during this period, but published under the pseudonym Sylvain Brûlé. And this was actually published in a series of journal articles in Paris during the War of Independence under the term L'Irlande insurgée. Thankfully, there's also an English version. And what he does in this is he kind of articulates what the Irish Republican movement and what the Irish Republic was. And he talks about it in intellectual terms, speaking of analogies to the French Revolution and how they are intellectual thinkers. The power of ideas, faith in the power of ideas is very important to the Republican movement. And that these are millenarians, that they believe in the fate of the Irish Republic. Now, what's interesting about this, going back to the Republic of Letters idea, is that this wasn't just printed on its own behest. It was actually printed in correspondence with leading Irish nationalists. So Owen MacNeill, who was the former leader of the Irish Volunteers, for example, read drafts of L'Irlande insurgée, offered comments, reviewed the document before it was published, which was kind of all part of this dialectic between Irish nationalists and others in terms of creating an Irish Republic for the world. Similarly, the other document is a kind of travelogue called An Egyptian in Ireland, obviously represented here in Arabic, by Ibrahim Rashid, who is an Egyptian based in London, a student based in London, who under the tutelage of Art O'Brien and Michael Collins ended up writing this kind of version of what the Irish Republic was. And again, they read over drafts, he consulted them on his ideas on how to present the Irish Republic, and his main argument as such was that the Irish Republic was a representation of economic development, the highest point of economic development or self-help, so to speak, in the British Empire. So it wasn't a political movement, it was an economic movement of significant proportions. So the intellectual exchanges are part of this process for making, for writing, and indeed for revising what the Irish Republic was in print. So in conclusion, where do we go from here? Introducing his recent edited collection, Global History Globally, Harvard historian Sten Beckert adduced, quote, "Global history must establish global dialogues and global intellectual exchanges. The community of global historians needs to make sustained efforts to change both historical thinking and its underlying patterns of interaction," unquote. And the HRC-funded project, of which I'm a part, A Global History of Irish Revolution 1916 to 23, signifies one such collaborative endeavour. Running between 2017 and 2020, the project adopts a transnational focus to explore the global impacts of and influences on Ireland's revolution between Rising and Civil War. Such funding privileges me, I would say, as research fellow, to visit archives in Australia, Britain, Canada, the United States and beyond. That's just my wish list, of course, with a view to writing the first global history of the Irish Revolution. However, with great funding comes great responsibility. The Irish world of a century ago was not only an Anglophone experience, it was not only a Western experience, indeed, it was not only an Irish experience. The Irish world, then as now, was round. To circumnavigate the Irish world involves cultural encounter, scholarly exchange, and interdisciplinary connection. The Global Irish Revolution project here at Queen's University Belfast, I would argue, can contribute to this cosmopolitan, less metropolitan network of ideas and interests. This presentation, in conclusion, is a call to historians of Ireland, present and indeed beyond, to see, read and write the Irish Revolution to scale, its global scale. As C.A. Bailey, the doyen of global history, has observed, quote, all local, national or regional histories must, in important ways, be global histories, unquote. That importance, I would suggest, lies in thinking outside of the Irish archive box. Engaging with international scholars and their ideas about the world, past as present, can define the very meaning of being a global historian. In short, I think, therefore I am. Thank you.